What if the very marketplace that promises to empower small businesses was secretly designed to outplay them all? In 2020, third-party sellers were celebrating a milestone. For the first time, they were responsible for over 60% of all items sold on Amazon. It seemed like the American dream had gone digital, a vast bazaar where any seller, big or small, could reach millions of customers. But behind the scenes, whispers began to surface. Sellers reported mysteriously plummeting sales after reaching a certain threshold. Others noticed their best-selling products suddenly being undercut, not by another rival, but by Amazon itself. And then came the unmistakable pattern. If a product performed well, it mysteriously found a near-identical competitor bearing the Amazon Basics label, often priced lower and given prime real estate on the site. On July 29, 2020, the CEO of the most powerful e-commerce empire in history, Jeff Bezos, appeared before the United States House Judiciary Committee. For the first time, he faced questions not about innovation, but about power, raw, unchecked, and potentially abusive. Does Amazon ever access and use third-party seller data when making business decisions? A representative asked. Bezos paused. "I can't guarantee that policy has never been violated," he admitted. It was a rare crack in the company's polished facade. But that moment, broadcast live, clipped into viral headlines, replayed in countless legal briefings, wasn't the climax. It was just a symptom. Behind the public drama lay a deeper architecture, an ecosystem meticulously constructed to absorb, monitor, and neutralize competition from within. A system where the referee also played the game and changed the rules mid-match. And while millions of consumers clicked "Buy Now" with confidence, few realized that what looked like a level playing field was in fact a labyrinth with only one real winner. But to understand how it really happened, we need to go back.
At what point does convenience turn into control? When does a company's success stop being a result of competition and start becoming the cause of its disappearance? For years, Amazon was celebrated as the ultimate marketplace, efficient, customer-centric, and brutally competitive. It promised endless choice, fast shipping, and prices that undercut everyone else. It positioned itself as a friend of the consumer, a champion of small business, and a platform where entrepreneurship thrived. And in many ways, those promises were real. But beneath the surface, a darker question lurked. Can a company that owns the market also fairly referee it? By the late 2010s, a growing chorus of lawmakers, economists, and former Amazon employees began to speak out. Their concern wasn't that Amazon was big, it was that it was everywhere. It wasn't just selling products, it was designing the digital shelf, controlling who got top placement, and deciding which sellers would thrive or vanish. Could any competitor truly win if the house always wins? A 2019 investigation by the Wall Street Journal uncovered something chilling. Amazon employees had used internal data from individual third-party sellers to develop competing products. This data included unit sales, revenue, profit margins, and even marketing strategies, all collected from sellers who had no idea they were being surveilled by their platform host. Amazon initially denied the practice, then later admitted it could not guarantee it hadn't occurred. That admission sent a ripple through Washington and Brussels alike. But the real issue wasn't just data. It was design. Amazon's very architecture seemed optimized not just to host competition, but to harvest it. The search algorithm, the buy box, the review systems, all proprietary, all opaque, and all susceptible to quiet manipulation. In a truly open market, price and quality determine success. But on Amazon, success often seemed determined by one invisible actor: Amazon itself. And then there was the paradox. Third-party sellers accounted for more than half of Amazon's sales, yet they had no control over the system they relied on. They couldn't access the algorithm, they couldn't negotiate fees, and most of all, they couldn't escape. If they left, they lost access to hundreds of millions of customers. If they stayed, they played a game where the rules could change at any moment. So the question remained, was this the inevitable result of brilliance and efficiency? Or was it something more sinister? Was Amazon simply playing smarter, or had it rewritten the rulebook of capitalism itself?
In the summer of 1994, a 30-year-old former Wall Street hedge fund executive named Jeff Bezos sat in the passenger seat of a car driving across the country from New York to Seattle. He had just quit his job at D.E. Shaw & Co., a fast-rising quantitative hedge fund where he had been tipped as one of the firm's most promising talents. He left not because he was failing, but because he saw something bigger on the horizon: the internet. Bezos had read a statistic that would change his life, that internet usage was growing at 2,300% per year. To him, that number wasn't just impressive, it was destiny. Sitting in his car with a laptop, a notepad, and a business plan scribbled on napkins, he began outlining what would soon become Amazon.com. The original vision was modest, at least on the surface. Bezos believed that books were the perfect product for online commerce. They were standardized, easy to ship, and offered millions of titles, far more than any physical bookstore could hold. From the start, he wasn't trying to run a bookstore. He was trying to build a system that could scale, fast, wide, and deep. He called it Earth's biggest bookstore, but his mind was already on something far more ambitious: the everything store. Amazon launched in July 1995, operating from Bezos's garage with just a handful of employees. The early website was crude, the operations chaotic. Orders were manually packed on the floor, and everyone, including Bezos, took turns driving boxes to the post office. But customers came. In the first month alone, Amazon sold books to all 50 U.S. states and over 40 countries. Revenue exploded from $511,000 in 1995 to over $15 million the next year. The momentum was unstoppable. But what truly set Bezos apart wasn't just speed, it was strategy. He made a deliberate choice to run at a loss for years, reinvesting every cent into growth. Get big fast wasn't just a slogan, it was a survival plan. Bezos understood that in the world of e-commerce, dominance would belong to the first mover who could build scale, logistics, and customer loyalty before anyone else realized what was happening. He also had a guiding obsession: the customer. Amazon's internal culture worshipped customer satisfaction, often at the expense of profits or even partner relationships. We're not competitor-obsessed, we're customer-obsessed. We start with what the customer needs, and we work backwards. But even in those early years, that obsession was already raising eyebrows. Was it true customer loyalty or the beginning of customer dependency? By the late 1990s, Amazon had expanded beyond books, first into CDs, then electronics, then toys. The vision was starting to materialize. But no one, not even his closest advisors, could have predicted that just a decade later, Amazon wouldn't just be selling products, it would be building the very roads on which modern commerce runs. The dream had been planted, and like all powerful dreams, it would eventually outgrow its roots and start reshaping the world around it. As the 2000s unfolded, Amazon was no longer just growing, it was evolving. What began as a bold bet on books was mutating into a digital empire, piece by calculated piece. And with every new vertical added, from electronics to apparel, from home goods to cloud services, Amazon was quietly laying down something far more valuable than just product lines. It was laying down infrastructure. The first transformative step came in 2000 when Amazon launched its marketplace, a feature that allowed third-party sellers to list their products directly on the Amazon site alongside Amazon's own inventory. At the time, it seemed like a generous move, a way for small businesses to share the stage with a rising tech giant. But beneath the surface, it was a masterstroke. With Marketplace, Amazon didn't need to stock or source every item. It simply became the gatekeeper. Every sale made through a third-party seller still flowed through Amazon's platform, giving it visibility, control, and more importantly, a cut. Jeff Bezos saw it clearly. By owning the platform, Amazon could benefit from every transaction without holding the risk of inventory. Sellers would fight for visibility, invest in ads, and submit to Amazon's rules, all while giving Amazon front-row access to real-time data on what sold, how fast, and at what margin. Marketplace was no longer just a convenience. It was surveillance, neatly packaged as opportunity. Then came Fulfillment by Amazon in 2006. This program allowed sellers to store their products in Amazon's warehouses and let Amazon handle shipping, returns, and customer service. On paper, it was another win for efficiency, but in practice, it created a two-tiered system. Sellers who used FBA saw their products gain higher visibility, faster shipping badges, and priority in the coveted buy box. Those who didn't? They were quietly buried beneath algorithmic rubble. By giving preference to sellers who paid for FBA, Amazon was subtly coercing the very businesses it claimed to support. And with each warehouse it built, each logistical node it added to its network, Amazon deepened its grip, not just over its own operations, but over the entire third-party ecosystem. The company's ambitions were no longer about competing on price or even on selection. They were about owning the rails, the infrastructure through which all online commerce had to pass. The more sellers joined Amazon, the more indispensable Amazon became. By 2010, more than 30% of all units sold on Amazon came from third-party sellers. Within 5 years, that number would exceed 50%. The platform was booming, but so was its asymmetry. Even Amazon's internal culture evolved to reflect this shift. The company became obsessed with automation, efficiency, and scale. It coined terms like flywheel to describe the self-reinforcing cycle of lower prices, better selection, and faster delivery, all of which drove more traffic, which attracted more sellers, which generated more data, which powered better algorithms. It was elegant, relentless, and to competitors, terrifying. But there was a side effect few outside the company could yet see. The same engine that empowered sellers was slowly making them obsolete. As Amazon studied what worked, it didn't just celebrate success, it began to replicate it, quietly, systematically, and with far more power than any individual seller could ever hope to wield. The infrastructure had been built, the sellers had come, and now Amazon was about to show what happens when the host begins to eat the guests. By the early 2010s, Amazon was no longer just scaling. It was blitzscaling. The term, later popularized by venture capitalists to describe companies that prioritize speed over efficiency, could have been invented for Amazon. Year after year, the company poured every ounce of profit, and often more, back into expansion. It wasn't enough to be dominant. Amazon wanted to be inescapable. From 2010 to 2020, Amazon's revenue grew from $34 billion to over $386 billion, a more than tenfold increase in just a decade. It built fulfillment centers at a pace no logistics company had ever attempted, more than 175 warehouses globally by 2021, many within miles of major metro areas. Prime Delivery evolved from 2-day shipping to same-day delivery in select cities. The company's shipping costs alone surged past $60 billion annually, and yet the machine never slowed.
But this growth wasn't just physical, it was algorithmic. Amazon's core engine, the search and recommendation algorithms, evolved into black box systems driven by machine learning, optimized for one thing: conversion. What products made people click, buy, and return? What pricing structures triggered urgency? What seller behaviors correlated with success or failure? Every seller on the platform was not just a participant, but an unknowing data point. Their wins were mapped, their strategies reverse engineered, and their margins studied, often to be replicated by Amazon itself. A key vehicle for this replication was Amazon Basics, a private label brand launched in 2009 but weaponized in the following years. At first, it offered mundane items, cables, batteries, office supplies. But over time, its footprint exploded. By 2020, Amazon had over 100 private label brands across dozens of categories, many indistinguishable from real independent brands. Some didn't even mention Amazon in the name, a tactic to reduce consumer skepticism. But behind the curtain, the pattern was clear. Find what sells, then build a house brand to replace it. This wasn't theory, it was process. Internal documents leaked in 2020 revealed Amazon's product lifecycle for copying third-party goods. Using sales data from Marketplace, Amazon teams identified rising stars, analyzed keyword trends, and fast-tracked nearly identical products under private labels. Once launched, these clones often received better placement in search, preferential treatment in the buy box, and even exclusive Prime shipping benefits. It was a loop no competitor could beat. Sellers proved a concept, Amazon industrialized it. And when complaints arose from sellers, analysts, even regulators, the company denied any systematic strategy. "We don't use seller data to compete," they said, but evidence kept mounting. Meanwhile, Amazon's expansion wasn't limited to retail. In 2015, it quietly launched Amazon Advertising, an ad platform that would soon generate over $30 billion a year, turning product listings into paid battlegrounds. The more sellers Amazon onboarded, the more competition they faced, and the more they had to pay to stand out. The platform became a toll booth. Want visibility? Pay up. Want the buy box? Use FBA. Want traffic? Bid against your peers, all while Amazon took a cut from everyone. Marketplaces had long been a space for merchants to meet buyers. But on Amazon, the marketplace itself became the merchant, and the auctioneer, and the landlord, and the sheriff. What began as a dream of democratized e-commerce was morphing into something else, a digital empire governed by secret rules, powered by data only one player could fully see, and expanding faster than any regulator could track. This wasn't just growth, it was systemic dominance, built step by step, sale by sale, until the very idea of competition began to feel quaint.
By the mid-2010s, Amazon wasn't merely dominant. It had become a gravitational force. Competing against Amazon was no longer a matter of pricing, selection, or logistics. It was about oxygen. Because once Amazon entered your vertical, it didn't just squeeze margins, it removed the very conditions in which competition could survive. Independent e-commerce websites began disappearing at an alarming rate. Sellers who once thrived on Shopify, eBay, or niche platforms reported massive drop-offs in traffic as consumers defaulted to Amazon by habit. Why search 10 different sites when one promised everything? Why take a risk on an unknown merchant when Amazon Prime guaranteed free 2-day shipping and a no-questions-asked return policy? Former executives at Diapers.com, once a rising e-commerce player, recalled the chilling efficiency of Amazon's playbook. In 2010, when Diapers.com, run by Quidsi Inc., refused to sell, Amazon slashed diaper prices on its own site below cost, bleeding hundreds of millions in losses to undercut their rival. Eventually, Quidsi caved and sold for $545 million. Within a few years, Amazon quietly shut it down. This wasn't an isolated case. As Amazon expanded into categories like fashion, electronics, groceries, and even pharmaceuticals, a familiar pattern emerged. Competing companies were acquired, copied, or suffocated. Smaller platforms couldn't match Amazon's logistics. Brands couldn't match its ad budget. Retailers couldn't match its scale. And third-party sellers who once sought independence found themselves caught in a paradox. They couldn't afford to be on Amazon, but they couldn't afford not to be. By 2018, Amazon was responsible for nearly 40% of all U.S. e-commerce, according to eMarketer. In some categories, like books, that number surged above 80%. And it wasn't just online. Amazon's influence began bleeding into brick-and-mortar retail. When Amazon acquired Whole Foods in 2017, grocers panicked. Kroger's stock plummeted. Walmart accelerated its online integration. The message was clear. Amazon could and would enter any industry it pleased. Inside the platform, power consolidated further. The buy box, Amazon's primary interface for purchasing, became a gatekeeper. Sellers who didn't play by Amazon's evolving rules lost access to it, effectively vanishing from customer view. Price parity clauses, once standard in Amazon seller agreements, prohibited sellers from offering lower prices elsewhere, even on their own websites. It was, in effect, a non-compete clause, enforced not by contract, but by algorithm. And the silence was deafening. Competitors didn't sue. Sellers didn't revolt. Consumers didn't notice, because the engine was too convenient, too fast, too seamless. Even those who knew the rules were skewed still clicked Buy Now. The system was working for the buyer, but for everyone else, the walls were closing in. A 2019 report by the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust concluded that Amazon had significant and durable market power, and that it had used that power to exploit sellers and to bolster its own position. Yet enforcement lagged, legal action stalled. Regulators debated definitions while Amazon moved faster than any bureaucracy could respond. At this stage, Amazon was no longer just a platform. It was the default, the place consumers started their search, the place sellers had to be, the place where alternatives died quietly, not through dramatic takeovers, but through attrition, fatigue, and dependency. And once dependency takes root, the line between platform and monopoly begins to blur. Amazon didn't need to crush competitors, it just needed to wait for them to drown, gasping for breath in an ecosystem they no longer controlled.
It began with a trickle. A seller here, a whistleblower there. Quiet voices speaking out, not from the centers of power, but from the edges, where the weight of Amazon's dominance was felt most acutely. In 2015, a seller named Jason Boyce, who had built a successful business on Amazon, began noticing something strange. After years of steady growth, his listings suddenly dropped in visibility. His sales plummeted, even though nothing had changed in his pricing or inventory. He realized the buy box had vanished from his product pages, and along with it, any real chance at conversion. It was like someone flipped a switch, he later testified, and we were invisible. Boyce wasn't alone. Hundreds of sellers began reporting similar experiences in online forums and private groups. Some saw their listings pushed down in search after refusing to use fulfillment by Amazon. Others had entire accounts suspended with little warning over vague violations of policy. Appeals were slow, opaque, and often fruitless. The message was implicit but clear: play by Amazon's rules or disappear. In 2016, the nonprofit group, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, ILSR, published one of the first comprehensive reports criticizing Amazon's market dominance. Titled Amazon Stranglehold, it outlined how the company had moved from marketplace to gatekeeper, controlling not only how products were sold, but who could sell them and under what terms. Amazon is using its platform to undermine competition, extract wealth, and consolidate power, the report warned. The mainstream media barely noticed. But then came the case of Peak Design. A small San Francisco-based company known for innovative camera bags and gear found itself unexpectedly competing with a near-identical product under Amazon's private label, Everyday Sling. The resemblance wasn't subtle, it was a carbon copy, from dimensions to design. when the company posted a sarcastic video mocking the copycat, it went viral. For the first time, the public saw what had long been whispered in seller circles. Amazon wasn't just watching, it was replicating. Journalists began paying attention. In 2018, The Verge published a scathing exposé titled Amazon's Curious Case of the Lookalike Products. That same year, ProPublica investigated how Amazon's algorithms consistently favored its products and those from sellers who paid more in fees and ads. The narrative was shifting. Then came the House Judiciary Committee. In 2019, under the leadership of Representative David Cicilline, Congress launched a sweeping investigation into big tech. Amazon was one of 4 companies under the microscope. The committee invited public comments, and thousands poured in. Sellers described a Kafkaesque world of shadow rules, AI-driven punishments, and ever-rising fees. "They're not our partner," one seller anonymously wrote. "They're our competitor, our regulator, and our judge." Still, Amazon denied wrongdoing. In press releases and interviews, executives insisted that the company empowered small businesses, that 1.9 million U.S. jobs were supported by sellers on Amazon, and that the platform provided unprecedented access to global markets. The contradictions grew louder. The complaints weren't just about business, they were about power, unseen, unaccountable, and growing. And while the public still loved Prime delivery and binge-watched Amazon originals, the sellers, the very backbone of the marketplace, began to ask, at what point does partnership become captivity? What started as whispers had become a low, persistent rumble, and those in Washington, Brussels, and beyond were finally starting to listen.
It wasn't a raid, it wasn't a subpoena. It didn't make headlines, but sometime in mid-2018, a quiet shift occurred within the halls of power in Washington and Brussels. After years of tech euphoria, of celebrating innovation and disruption, regulators began to ask a different kind of question. Not how Amazon had succeeded, but what that success had cost. In Europe, the alarm rang first. Margrethe Vestager, the European Commissioner for Competition, had already made headlines for fining Google and Apple in landmark antitrust cases. In September 2018, her office announced a formal investigation into Amazon. The focus was surgical: how Amazon used data from independent sellers on its marketplace to inform the development and promotion of its own competing products. It was a novel question, one tailor-made for the age of platforms. Vestager framed it simply: we need to ensure that large online platforms don't eliminate the benefits of e-commerce through anti-competitive behavior. Amazon responded cautiously. It said it was cooperating fully, but disputed any wrongdoing. It portrayed itself as a neutral enabler of commerce, a modern-day shopping mall. But unlike a mall, regulators noted, Amazon didn't just rent out storefronts, it decided where they stood, how much rent they paid, and whether their lights stayed on. In the United States, scrutiny took longer. The Federal Trade Commission, FTC, historically cautious in tech matters, began quietly gathering information. Staffers interviewed sellers, former Amazon employees, and industry analysts. Internally, some lawyers questioned whether existing antitrust laws, rooted in 20th century brick-and-mortar markets, could even apply to a platform as fluid and sprawling as Amazon. But pressure was mounting. In July 2019, the House Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on Antitrust, Commercial and Administrative Law, led by Representative Cicilline, held the first of a series of hearings on digital marketplaces. The mood was skeptical, even adversarial. Lawmakers from both parties questioned whether companies like Amazon were too big, too secretive, and too essential to remain unregulated. Cicilline, a former antitrust lawyer himself, was blunt. Amazon has monopoly power over many small and medium-sized businesses that don't have a choice but to sell on its platform. He invited written testimony. Over the next year, over 30,000 documents were reviewed. What emerged was a portrait of a company that designed the game, played the game and punished those who tried to win by other rules. One internal memo, later leaked, described how Amazon identified best-selling products, then created its own versions and tested them in search rankings. Another document showed Amazon executives debating whether to hide listings from brands that refused to buy ads. A third outlined pricing parity clauses meant to suppress competition outside the platform. These weren't isolated abuses, they were patterns. The language of regulation began to shift. Platform neutrality, self-preferencing, and data asymmetry entered the lexicon. Think tanks like the Open Markets Institute and Yale Law School's Thurman Arnold Project published white papers urging bold antitrust action. Meanwhile, Lina Khan, then a legal scholar, later to become FTC chair, published Amazon's Antitrust Paradox, a seminal paper arguing that traditional antitrust metrics failed to capture the platform's distortive power. Still, there was no official case, no lawsuit, just a gathering storm. In late 2019, Amazon executives were summoned to provide documents under oath. The company hired lobbyists at record levels. It published blog posts celebrating its value to small business. But behind the scenes, a different tone prevailed, one of vigilance, even anxiety. The regulators weren't just knocking, they were coming in, files in hand. And once regulators enter the room, something fundamental changes. The burden of proof begins to shift. The presumption of innocence turns into a presumption of scrutiny. Amazon, the untouchable innovator, was now the subject of investigation. The empire was being measured not just by its success, but by its structure.
Amazon had faced controversy before: product recalls, warehouse labor protests, public backlash over its HQ2 bidding war. But what unfolded between 2019 and 2020 was something categorically different. This wasn't just noise, this was structural, institutional. The scrutiny wasn't coming from journalists or activist groups, it was coming from governments. And Amazon responded the only way a trillion-dollar corporation knows how: with precision, polish, and power. Internally, the company activated its Public Policy and Government Affairs Division, a rapidly expanding arm with growing influence in Washington, D.C. In 2019 alone, Amazon spent over $16 million on federal lobbying, nearly triple what it spent just 5 years earlier. It hired former staffers from Congress, the FTC, and even the Department of Justice. The message was clear: Amazon wasn't just defending its image, it was defending its future. The public narrative shifted quickly. Executives released statements emphasizing how the platform empowered over 2 million small businesses worldwide, created hundreds of thousands of jobs, and offered unmatched value to consumers. Blog posts and sponsored op-eds appeared in major outlets like the Washington Post, ironically owned by Jeff Bezos, extolling Amazon's role in leveling the playing field. When questioned about marketplace dominance, Amazon reframed the issue. "We are just 1% of global retail," they said repeatedly. "Competition is one click away." It was a carefully selected statistic, one that lumped Amazon's online platform in with every physical store on Earth, from corner bodegas to mega malls. It sounded modest. It was anything but. In hearings, Amazon's lawyers denied that the company engaged in anti-competitive behavior. When confronted with internal documents suggesting otherwise, they labeled them taken out of context. They framed Amazon Basics as a benefit to consumers, a source of cheaper alternatives, no different than Kirkland at Costco. When asked about data scraping, they replied, "We prohibit that practice." When pressed on enforcement, they deflected. "We can't guarantee no policy has ever been violated." Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Amazon took steps to restructure risk. Reports emerged that the company was reorganizing its private label operations, potentially to shield decision-making from legal scrutiny. Some teams were split, renamed, or dissolved. Others were brought under new reporting lines. It wasn't an admission of guilt, it was a prophylactic maneuver designed to complicate enforcement. Sellers noticed subtler shifts. Certain search algorithms were tweaked. Price parity clauses were removed from contracts in Europe after EU regulators objected. Publicly, Amazon claimed these changes were about improving the user experience, Privately, insiders admitted they were meant to preempt regulatory findings. And perhaps most telling of all, Amazon doubled down on trust language. In blogs, interviews, and press releases, the company began referring to itself as customer-obsessed, data-driven, fair, and transparent. It sponsored small business roundtables. It launched Amazon Small Business Academy. It rolled out new seller support programs with names like Account Health Rating. All of it aimed to project a singular message: we are a platform for prosperity. But behind the PR machinery, tension simmered. Emails between executives, later made public, revealed concern over potential investigations. In one, a senior leader warned that certain private label tactics could invite regulatory scrutiny. In another, internal audits flagged that safeguards preventing the misuse of seller data were inadequate. Amazon wasn't panicking, it was maneuvering, calculating, building a defense not in courtrooms, but in headlines, contracts, and architecture. Because the company understood something crucial. The first punch doesn't knock you out, but it tells you the fight has begun.
It took years of gathering evidence, testimony, and internal documents. But on November 10, 2020, the European Commission made its move. After more than 2 years of investigation, it filed formal antitrust charges against Amazon, accusing the company of abusing its dominant position in the European online retail market. At the heart of the case was a deceptively simple question: could a marketplace that monitors all its sellers ever be considered neutral? In legal terms, the accusation focused on Amazon's dual role, both as a platform for independent sellers and as a direct competitor to them. The commission alleged that Amazon had systematically used non-public business data, including order volumes, revenues, and customer behavior, collected from third-party sellers to calibrate its own private label offerings. In other words, Amazon was mining its own customers, then turning that data against them. "This is not about size," said Commissioner Margrethe Vestager during a press briefing. "This is about behavior. Amazon appears to use data to the detriment of other sellers on the marketplace. It distorts competition." The charges also addressed Amazon's buy box algorithm, suggesting that it systematically favored the company's own products or those using Fulfillment by Amazon, FBA, regardless of price or performance. The company's official response was swift and dismissive. "We disagree with the preliminary conclusions," Amazon said in a statement. "No company cares more about small businesses or has done more to support them over the past 2 decades than Amazon." But the tone was notably defensive, hinting at the seriousness of the threat. Across the Atlantic, momentum was building. On October 6, 2020, just 1 month earlier, the U.S. House Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust had published a sprawling 449-page report titled Investigation of Competition in Digital Markets. The section on Amazon was damning. It detailed with granular citations how the company allegedly leveraged its gatekeeper role to punish rivals, extract concessions, and prioritize its own growth at the expense of others. The report concluded, Amazon functions as a gatekeeper for e-commerce. It controls access to markets and information. Its dominance is self-reinforcing and anti-competitive. Among its recommendations, structural separation of Amazon's platform and retail operations, essentially a call to break the company apart. The market responded with unease. While Amazon's stock remained resilient, analysts began baking regulatory risk into their forecasts. "The era of unchecked growth is over," declared one Bloomberg headline. Behind closed doors, Amazon executives were reportedly divided, some insisting the company could weather the storm, others pushing for reforms to avoid a legal train wreck. But perhaps the most symbolic moment came on May 26, 2021, when Washington, D.C.'s Attorney General Karl Racine filed a lawsuit against Amazon in the District of Columbia Superior Court.
The complaint alleged that Amazon's contracts with sellers, including price parity clauses, suppressed competition and led to artificially higher prices across the web. This was the first domestic antitrust lawsuit directly targeting Amazon's core marketplace practices. More would follow. In June 2021, the German Federal Cartel Office expanded its investigation into Amazon's influence over sellers. In India, regulators probed whether Amazon favored select sellers it had indirect ownership in, an echo of the same structural manipulation alleged in Europe. And in the U.S., whispers grew that the Federal Trade Commission, now under the leadership of Lina Khan, was preparing its own case. The message was clear: Amazon's era of legal insulation had ended. This wasn't just another fine, another settlement, another temporary PR headache. It was a global reckoning, built not on sentiment or suspicion, but on paper trails, contracts, emails, and code. Governments, for the first time, were framing the question not as what has Amazon built, but how did it build it? The lawsuit had been filed, the case was open, and the empire would now have to defend itself in the light of law.
The chamber was silent as the doors opened. It wasn't a courtroom, but it felt like one. In July 29, 2020, amid a global pandemic and a nation on edge, 4 CEOs from the world's most powerful tech companies, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, logged into a remote, high-stakes congressional hearing. For Jeff Bezos, it was his first time testifying before Congress, and the timing couldn't have been worse. As the founder and face of Amazon, Bezos was appearing before the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust under the watchful eye of Chairman David Cecilian. The hearing was titled Online Platforms and Market Power, Part 6, examining the dominance of Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google. But in reality, it was Amazon's marketplace practices that drew some of the sharpest fire. Bezos, dressed in a crisp navy suit, appeared composed, but the questions came fast, precise, and at times uncomfortably specific. Does Amazon access and use third-party seller data when making decisions to launch its own competing products? Asked Representative Pramila Jayapal of Washington, her tone calm but firm. Bezos hesitated. "I can't guarantee that policy has never been violated," he admitted. It was a moment of rare vulnerability. The richest man on earth had just confirmed what thousands of sellers had long suspected. Amazon's internal firewalls weren't impenetrable after all. Representative Lucy McBath pressed him further. "Do you think it's fair for a company that owns the marketplace to compete against the very sellers it claims to support?" Bezos replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I believe we're helping those sellers succeed." The subcommittee, however, had done its homework. Chairman Cecilian presented internal documents revealing Amazon's strategic analysis of reference sellers, top-performing third parties whose data was used to inform private label product launches. One executive email explicitly stated, "We're using seller data to guide our product roadmap." Another document discussed testing Amazon's own products in search results to maximize visibility. Each revelation chipped away at the company's carefully maintained image of neutrality. But it wasn't just the documents that made the hearing seismic, it was the tone. For the first time, lawmakers spoke not as deferential admirers of tech innovation, but as skeptics of unchecked power. Words like gatekeeper, self-preferencing, and monopoly echoed through the virtual walls. Even Republican lawmakers, typically cautious about regulation, joined in. "This isn't capitalism, it's cannibalism," one remarked. Bezos, to his credit, didn't lash out. He cited Amazon's role in empowering over 1.7 million small businesses globally. He emphasized low consumer prices, innovation, and customer satisfaction. But the narrative had shifted. Lawmakers weren't interested in growth metrics or holiday season logistics. They wanted accountability. Sellers, meanwhile, watched with mixed emotions. For some, it was vindication. For others, it felt too little, too late. One longtime seller posted in a private forum, "He said what we already knew, but at least now it's on the record." Outside the chamber, headlines exploded. Bezos admits Amazon can't guarantee seller data isn't abused, read one. Congress presses Bezos over marketplace monopoly, read another. For a company known for operating in quiet dominance, this was a rare moment of exposure. But hearings are not trials, they're theater. Their power lies not in verdicts, but in illumination. What the July 2020 hearing illuminated was profound. Amazon's central tension, platform versus participant, enabler versus exploiter, was no longer theoretical. It was documented, debated, and televised. And now that the curtain had been pulled back, the question wasn't whether Amazon would respond. The question was whether it could defend itself against what came next.
The following weeks saw a cascade of statements, white papers, and blog posts as Amazon entered full defense mode. If the hearing was the shot fired across the bow, this was the company raising its shield, not with outrage, but with spreadsheets, slogans, and strategic ambiguity. The company's central argument was simple, almost elegant in its clarity. Everything we do for the customer. In its official blog, Amazon began publishing detailed rebuttals to specific claims made during the hearings. One post, titled "Amazon Empowers Small Business," opened with a flourish of statistics. Over 1.9 million small and medium-sized businesses sell on Amazon worldwide. In 2019 alone, US-based sellers had sold over 3.4 billion products through the platform. Another entry, setting the record straight, challenged the notion of algorithmic bias, arguing that the buy box simply rewarded the best value for customers, not favoritism. Behind these public-facing messages, a more tactical strategy was emerging: reframe the debate. Rather than respond to accusations of anti-competitive behavior, Amazon leaned into consumer satisfaction. The company emphasized low prices, fast shipping, and a seamless shopping experience. "We obsess over what matters to consumers," executives repeated across media interviews. "We win only when they win." This consumer-first framing wasn't just PR, it was legal strategy. For decades, U.S. antitrust law has revolved around the consumer welfare standard, the idea that unless a company's behavior leads to higher prices or lower quality, it isn't anti-competitive. Amazon knew that as long as customers remained happy, regulators would face an uphill battle. And by almost any metric, customers were ecstatic. At the same time, Amazon invoked the specter of competition. "Retail is fiercely competitive," they argued. "We compete with Walmart, Target, Alibaba, and thousands of other retailers, both online and offline." Internally, Amazon had long used the phrase, "Competition is only a click away," a mantra designed to position the company not as a monopoly, but as a nimble player in a vast global field. Of course, what that framing ignored was that many of those competitors were simultaneously dependent on Amazon's infrastructure or quietly being outpaced by it. In legal filings and interviews, the company also challenged the definition of a market. Was Amazon dominating e-commerce? Maybe, but what if the relevant market was all of retail? That made Amazon's share seem modest. Was it controlling third-party sellers? Perhaps, but only in proportion to the value it provided. Amazon's marketplace, they claimed, gave sellers access to 300 million active customers, advanced analytics, and a robust logistics network. "We don't force anyone to sell on Amazon," spokespersons said. "Sellers choose us because we offer the best tools and the highest conversion." The implication was clear. If Amazon held power, it was earned, not imposed. Amazon also pointed to its investment in innovation. Billions spent on AI, on fulfillment centers, on sustainability initiatives. They showcased their COVID-19 response, how Amazon delivered essential goods during lockdowns, supported small business grants, and launched vaccine logistics in multiple countries. It was the story of a responsible giant, not a reckless one. Yet behind the veneer of logic, unease lingered. More and more sellers stepped forward to challenge the narrative.
A former Amazon product manager leaked memos suggesting that private label launches were in fact directly tied to seller performance data. Marketplace analytics continued to show that Amazon-branded products were disproportionately visible in search results, and questions about data separation between Amazon Retail and Amazon Marketplace remained unanswered. For all its polish, Amazon's defense began to resemble a fortress with thin walls, solid from afar, but fragile under pressure. Still, it was a defense rooted in deep strategic thinking. The company wasn't just answering questions, it was reminding regulators, subtly, of its importance to the modern economy. Take us down, the subtext read, and you risk disrupting everything from shipping logistics to vaccine distribution to global small business growth. The message was bold, if unspoken, but even the most carefully crafted arguments can falter when a single, undeniable truth comes to light, and what came next would change the trajectory of the entire case.
In every antitrust saga, there comes a moment when the case turns, not on a legal theory, but on a document, a sentence, a name, something undeniable. For Amazon, that moment arrived in April 2020, when the Wall Street Journal published a groundbreaking exposé titled "Amazon Scooped Up Data from Its Own Sellers to Launch Competing Products." The story, built on interviews with more than 20 former employees and access to internal documents, shattered the company's official narrative. According to the report, Amazon's private label team had routinely accessed individual third-party seller data, orders, profits, costs of goods sold, and used it to inform which products Amazon should clone under its in-house brands. This wasn't aggregate data. It was seller-specific, product by product, competitor by competitor. One former employee was quoted bluntly, "We knew we shouldn't be looking at this data, but at the same time we were making decisions based on it." The revelation sent shockwaves through Washington. Lawmakers, already wary, now had hard evidence. Representative David Cicilline, head of the House Antitrust Subcommittee, responded immediately. If true, these allegations contradict Amazon's sworn testimony. He called on Jeff Bezos to appear before Congress. The pressure was no longer rhetorical, it was prosecutorial. But the Journal report was only the beginning. Within weeks, Reuters published a second bombshell, this time focused on Amazon's operations in India. The article revealed a covert Amazon program internally known as Solimo, designed to replicate and dominate successful products by extracting performance data from third-party Indian sellers. One internal presentation described how Amazon created knockoff goods that looked eerily similar to popular items, then rigged the algorithm to boost their visibility. Even more damning, the report outlined how Amazon had equity stakes in certain sellers but hid those connections from regulators, creating the illusion of a competitive marketplace while secretly backing select winners. In effect, Amazon was playing both sides of the chessboard. The disclosures prompted formal investigations in India and Germany and reinforced the EU's ongoing case. But perhaps more importantly, they broke the seal. Employees, past and present, began leaking more. In May 2021, a former Amazon software engineer anonymously submitted a 12-page declaration to the FTC, detailing how the algorithm behind the buy box was adjusted not just for consumer experience, but to maximize Amazon's internal margin. He described A/B tests in which third-party sellers were intentionally rotated out of visibility to make room for Amazon-branded goods. The internal term for this was squeezing the juice. Shortly after, NBC News published a trove of leaked Slack messages and internal dashboards showing that Amazon managers had detailed real-time seller performance data, down to inventory turnover and refund frequency. One Slack thread showed a product manager recommending sunsetting a seller's product because our version is outperforming them and has higher margin potential. In court, Amazon's attorneys scrambled to contain the fallout. They argued that isolated abuses did not reflect company policy, that rogue employees had misunderstood guidelines, that enforcement protocols were being reviewed and improved. But it was too late. What had once been alleged had now been documented. The myth of the neutral platform had been pierced, not by speculation, but by the company's own words, systems, and metrics. It wasn't just a bad look, it was legal vulnerability. And for regulators who had struggled to explain how a company could dominate without raising prices, these leaks offered the missing link. A pattern of structural self-preferencing powered by unfair data access executed at platform scale. Suddenly, the case against Amazon wasn't about theory anymore. It was about intent. The line had been crossed, not in secret, but on spreadsheets, in Slack, on internal dashboards. And with each revelation, the room Amazon had to maneuver grew smaller. The empire had been exposed from the inside out.
By the time Amazon returned to face congressional questioning and regulatory hearings in mid-2021, the tone had shifted. The careful choreography of prior testimonies, smooth answers, well-rehearsed talking points was gone. What remained was tension. Raw, visible tension. The leaks had changed everything. Lawmakers were no longer speculating. They were citing, quoting, displaying documents on screen. Every sentence from an Amazon executive was now measured not against press releases, but against emails, Slack messages, and internal memos. Every denial risked becoming perjury. Every pause spoke louder than any defense. In one particularly explosive moment during a closed-door FTC hearing, a senior Amazon executive, previously head of marketplace strategy, was asked under oath whether he had ever seen internal dashboards displaying third-party seller data by name. He hesitated. Counsel leaned in. Yes, he admitted, we had access. We used it to monitor category trends. The room fell silent. Then came the follow-up question. Were you aware that such data was later used by Amazon's private label teams to launch competing products? I wasn't personally involved in that decision, he replied. But you knew it was happening. A pause. Then, yes. That admission cracked the defense. Amazon's position that it did not use seller-specific data was now irreparably weakened. And with it, the company's credibility began to erode. Meanwhile, the buy box algorithm came under fresh scrutiny. In court, expert witnesses testified how Amazon's ranking formula disproportionately favored sellers who used Fulfillment by Amazon, or FBA, regardless of product quality or customer feedback. An economist presented modeling that showed how even when a seller offered a lower price and faster shipping, they could still lose the buy box to an Amazon-controlled listing. Amazon's attorneys pushed back. The algorithm is complex, they argued. It balances over 100 variables. It optimizes for customer satisfaction, not Amazon's margin. But internal documentation told a different story, one in which those variables could be tweaked by business teams to promote Amazon's interests. One particularly damning exchange occurred when a former employee, now a whistleblower, appeared via video link. Shielded by legal protections, she testified about a secret internal program dubbed Project Nessie, designed to test price elasticity by artificially inflating prices on certain goods. If competitors followed suit, the algorithm allowed Amazon to quietly maintain higher prices without consumer backlash. If not, it reversed course. Amazon told the public that it always fights for lower prices, but inside, we had tools to experiment with raising them, just to see if we could get away with it. The courtroom, or in this case the regulatory chamber, felt more like a thriller unfolding live. Representatives from both parties grilled Amazon's legal team. European regulators launched new discovery requests. In Germany, the Federal Cartel Office expanded its probe to include search manipulation. In India, Parliament called for answers. Outside, the media ran headlines in bold. Amazon knew. Whistleblower confirms internal data abuse. The marketplace is not a level playing field. Stock analysts revised their long-term risk models. Shareholders sent private letters urging leadership to prepare for potential structural remedies. Internally, Amazon scrambled to issue new compliance protocols. A newly formed Marketplace Fairness Task Force was announced in a company-wide email, promising reviews of all internal data use policies. But for the regulators, it was too little, too late. The evidence was now a mosaic, built not by speculation, but by sworn testimony, insider records, and the company's own words. And at the center of it all stood the question no algorithm could spin. Was this a case of accidental dominance or engineered destruction of competition? The answer, increasingly, no longer seemed in doubt.
It didn't come with handcuffs. There was no CEO-led perp walk, no cinematic gavel pounding in a packed courtroom. But when the European Commission announced its settlement with Amazon on December 20, 2022, the implications were thunderous, an inflection point in the global reckoning with platform power. Rather than go to trial, Amazon had agreed to legally binding commitments, a sweeping set of reforms that would permanently alter how it operated its marketplace across the European Economic Area. In doing so, it narrowly avoided billions in antitrust fines. But the cost wasn't measured in euros alone, it was measured in control. Under the terms of the settlement, Amazon made several key concessions. 1. No more use of seller data. Amazon agreed not to use non-public data from independent sellers to compete with them. This covered everything from order volumes to click-through rates to refund statistics, data Amazon had quietly harvested for years. 2. Buy box reforms. The company committed to redesigning the buy box algorithm. From now on, when two offers were close in terms of price and delivery, a second competing offer would be shown, giving sellers a fairer shot at visibility. 3. No discrimination in Prime. Amazon could no longer force sellers to use its own logistics network, Fulfillment by Amazon, in order to qualify for Prime delivery. Alternative fulfillment providers, if certified, had to be treated equally. 4. Increased transparency. Sellers would receive more information about their performance metrics, search rankings, and account decisions, undoing years of opaque AI-governed punishment systems. The response was immediate. In Brussels, regulators hailed the agreement as a precedent-setting victory. Today's decision sets new standards for platform fairness, said Commissioner Margrethe Vestager. Amazon must play by the same rules as everyone else. In the United States, though no formal ruling had been made yet, the settlement gave Lina Khan's FTC and state attorneys general a new blueprint and a fresh burst of momentum. It proved that Amazon could be pressured, that regulation wasn't a relic, that platforms could be reshaped, not just by innovation, but by law. Inside Amazon, reactions were mixed. Publicly, executives framed the settlement as a constructive engagement with European regulators, part of the company's ongoing commitment to compliance. But internally, sources reported a different tone: frustration, urgency, and strategic recalibration. Teams were restructured. Private label operations in the EU were scaled back. Meetings multiplied with legal, PR, and engineering departments to implement commitments without compromising the customer experience. Sellers, for their part, watched with cautious hope. Some saw it as long overdue justice. Others feared that changes on paper might not translate to actual fairness on the platform. It's not the terms, it's the enforcement. Will Amazon follow through when the lights are off? One seller posted in a forum. Meanwhile, in India, Germany, and the US, other investigations pushed forward, emboldened by Europe's success. The Washington, D.C. Attorney General's office continued its case against price parity clauses. The FTC, under Lina Khan, was rumored to be preparing a sweeping antitrust complaint, possibly aiming to split Amazon's marketplace
from its retail division, a modern take on the Standard Oil solution. In markets and boardrooms, a new phrase entered circulation: Amazon's reckoning. And yet there was no collapse, no mass exodus of customers, no apology letter from Jeff Bezos. Amazon's share price wavered, but did not crash. The platform remained indispensable to millions of consumers and sellers. The system, dented, still stood. But something fundamental had changed. A line had been drawn, by regulators, by documents, by a company's own digital fingerprints. The settlement was a deal, yes, but to Amazon, it felt like a warning. A marker that the age of silent, unchecked expansion was over. The empire had not been broken, but it had been named. And sometimes, that's how revolutions begin. Not with a collapse, but with a word written in the language of law.
On February 2, 2021, just months after mounting regulatory pressure reached its boiling point, Amazon dropped a quiet bombshell. Jeff Bezos would step down as CEO. The announcement came not from a courtroom or a crisis meeting, but from an investor letter. Matter of fact, efficient, unmistakably Bezos. Being the CEO of Amazon is a deep responsibility, and it's consuming, he wrote. I've never had more energy, and this isn't about retiring. I'm transitioning to executive chair to focus on initiatives like the Day One Fund, the Bezos Earth Fund, Blue Origin. The list went on. But no amount of polished phrasing could mask the timing. The man who had personified Amazon for over 25 years, who had built it from a garage startup into a trillion-dollar empire, was stepping aside just as the empire was under siege. For some, it was a passing of the torch. For others, it looked like a strategic retreat. Bezos' successor, Andy Jassy, was no outsider. As the architect of Amazon Web Services, AWS, the company's most profitable and least controversial division, he was seen as a stabilizer, a systems thinker, a quiet executor. His leadership style contrasted sharply with Bezos' visionary fire. Jassy wasn't there to reimagine the future, he was there to manage the damage. Markets responded with restrained optimism, but behind the scenes, Amazon's boardroom felt the tremors. In the weeks following the European settlement, Amazon's stock, while far from collapse, lost over 10% of its value, erasing more than $170 billion in market capitalization. Analysts from JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs downgraded the company from strong buy to neutral, citing increased regulatory exposure and margin pressure. Shareholder calls turned tense. Shareholder letters demanded clarity. What structural changes would Amazon implement? Would it spin off Marketplace or AWS to avoid antitrust blowback? Would private label operations be scaled down globally? Was the golden age of exponential growth over? Inside Amazon, top executives scrambled to restore confidence. A newly established global public policy group was elevated to report directly to the CEO. Internal policy documents were rewritten to reflect best practices in data ethics. Training modules were rolled out to teams handling marketplace and retail analytics. Engineers were instructed to implement stricter data access controls, now monitored by independent compliance officers. And yet, the mood was not one of transformation, it was of triage. Warehouse workers noticed little change. Customers continued buying, but within Amazon's core, a quiet anxiety grew. Sellers were more vocal, regulators were more aggressive. Employees once proud of their company's relentless drive now whispered about burnout, lawsuits, and a creeping sense that Amazon had peaked, not financially, but philosophically. The departure of Bezos only added to that impression. His image had once symbolized a new kind of capitalism, efficient, visionary, relentless. Now it risked being remembered as something more complicated, the builder of a system too powerful for the rules that once governed it. One Bloomberg columnist put it bluntly, Bezos didn't step down because he was done. He stepped down because the era he represented is done. Outside, critics were no longer asking if Amazon would change, but how deeply it would be forced to. Inside, managers tightened compliance, sellers recalibrated strategies, and investors, once giddy at every earnings call, began watching for signs of structural fatigue.
Amazon, once the untouchable titan of modern commerce, now faced the unthinkable, a future constrained not by rivals, but by regulation. The king left the throne, the machine kept running, but its hum no longer sounded like inevitability. It sounded like caution.
When a company like Amazon is forced to change, the ripple effects aren't confined to its balance sheet. They echo across the entire marketplace it helped define. And as the legal scrutiny turned into policy, into settlement, into precedent, something remarkable began to happen. An industry that had long moved in Amazon's shadow began to move away from it. First came the competitors, cautiously at first, then more boldly. Walmart, long trailing in e-commerce, seized the moment. It rolled out seller-friendly policies, offering lower fees and more transparency. Unlike Amazon, Walmart pledged not to launch in-house brands that competed with marketplace sellers. "We don't sell data," one executive quipped during an investor call. "We sell opportunity." Shopify, the Canadian e-commerce platform that once served as a quiet alternative for independent brands, surged in popularity. Its CEO, Toby Lutke, leaned into the contrast. He said, "We're not building a mall with surveillance cameras. We're building the roads and tools for people to build their own stores." The narrative resonated. By 2022, Shopify was processing over $175 billion in merchant sales, its valuation skyrocketing as Amazon faced regulatory headwinds. Startups, too, began to shift strategies. The goal was no longer to build the next Amazon for X. Instead, founders sought to design anti-Amazon models, decentralized, data-transparent, seller-first platforms. Venture capitalists, once obsessed with platform dominance, began funding projects that emphasized cooperative ownership, open algorithms, and ethical logistics. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, regulators in France, Germany, and Spain began exploring platform regulation frameworks that went even further than the European Commission's settlement. In France, a proposal emerged that would require dominant marketplaces to open their search algorithms to audit, a radical concept just a few years prior. In Australia, the ACCC launched an inquiry into marketplace self-preferencing, using Amazon as the central case study. In the United States, the impact was more fragmented, but still visible. The American Innovation and Choice Online Act, a bipartisan bill introduced in 2021, proposed restrictions on self-preferencing by dominant platforms. Though it faced delays in Congress, its mere existence marked a turning point. The language of digital fairness was no longer fringe, it was legislative. Even Amazon's fellow tech giants felt the tremors. Google, facing its own antitrust challenges, adjusted how it displayed shopping results, offering more space to external sellers. Apple, under pressure in its App Store practices, began allowing developers to direct users to outside payment options. The unspoken logic was clear. If Amazon could be cornered, anyone could. And inside companies across the digital economy, compliance officers gained new power. "What's our buy box policy?" became a boardroom question. "Are we scraping data?" became a legal risk, not just an engineering shortcut. Terms like gatekeeper behavior and algorithmic accountability entered the vocabulary of general counsel and product managers alike. Perhaps most surprisingly, consumer behavior began to shift. Reports showed rising searches for brand websites as shoppers increasingly sought to buy direct. Surveys found that younger consumers, particularly Gen Z, expressed concern over platform ethics, choosing where to shop not only based on price, but on transparency and values. Amazon still dominated, of course, but it no longer defined the future. The architecture of digital commerce, once designed around maximizing scale and surveillance, now faced competing blueprints, some smaller, some slower, but all asking the same question: what does fair commerce look like in the platform age? The answer was still forming, but thanks to the scrutiny, the lawsuits, and the whistleblowers, one thing was clear: the Amazon model was no longer the only model. The monopoly had met resistance, not just in court, but in code, in culture, and in capital. and the age of quiet imitation was over.
Even empires that survive still bleed. And though Amazon weathered the legal storm, avoiding a corporate breakup, maintaining market dominance, and preserving its financial engine, the scars of its antitrust saga did not fade easily. In some ways, they deepened with time. Internally, the wounds were subtle but undeniable. Morale among key teams, especially those in marketplace strategy and private label development, fell sharply after the investigations. Once proud employees who had viewed themselves as disruptors now wrestled with a more complex identity. Had we built tools of empowerment or engines of extraction? An internal employee satisfaction survey leaked in 2023 showed a stark dip in trust toward leadership. One open comment read, "We talk about customer obsession, but we never talk about seller trust." Another added, "The mission used to feel bold. Now it feels defensive." In public, the perception shift was even sharper. Amazon had long been seen as both a marvel and a menace, but mostly a marvel. The one-click convenience, the unmatched logistics, the ability to get anything, anywhere, anytime, it all contributed to a kind of grudging awe. But after the hearings, the leaks, the settlements, a new narrative emerged. Amazon, the predator in platforms clothing. Think pieces flooded the media. The New York Times ran a headline, "When Convenience Becomes Control, Reconsidering Our Relationship with Amazon." On YouTube, explainers dissected the antitrust hearings, drawing millions of views. In business schools, case studies began to evolve, from admiration of Amazon's flywheel to critiques of its dominance mechanisms. Jeff Bezos, once heralded as the patron saint of scale, found himself referenced alongside Rockefeller and Gates, not in admiration, but in regulation. Even consumer advocacy groups found a louder voice. The Public Citizen Foundation and the Electronic Frontier Foundation released detailed reports tracking Amazon's algorithmic bias, its lobbying strategies, and its treatment of sellers. For the first time, mainstream media carried these stories on front pages rather than buried business sections. Meanwhile, small businesses, once too intimidated to speak, began forming new alliances. The Online Sellers United Coalition, formed in 2022, published annual marketplace fairness reports, grading platforms on transparency, data protection, and seller empowerment. Amazon, once the model, now ranked below Shopify and even Walmart. For Bezos himself, the legacy grew heavier. Though he had stepped back from day-to-day operations, his name remained inseparable from the brand. In interviews promoting Blue Origin, his space exploration venture, journalists still asked about the antitrust cases. One segment on 60 Minutes showed a clip from his 2020 congressional testimony next to footage of rocket launches, inviting viewers to draw their own contrast between the man's dreams and his consequences. The company's philanthropic efforts, millions in climate initiatives, pandemic relief, and education, continued, but they no longer muted criticism. The question had become louder. Can a company so deeply embedded in the economy ever truly be benevolent? Amazon survived. It adapted. It restructured algorithms, revised policies, offered transparency dashboards. But reputation isn't just managed, it's lived. And for millions of sellers, watchdogs, and wary consumers, the image of the smiling arrow beneath the company's name no longer meant trust. It meant trade-off. Perhaps the deepest scar was not legal or cultural or economic. Perhaps it was existential. Because Amazon had long promised to be customer-obsessed, and in doing so, asked the world to overlook the machinery that made that obsession possible. But now the world had looked, and what it saw, data mining, self-preferencing, power without accountability, could not be unseen. The empire would continue, but innocence, once lost, does not regenerate, not in platforms, not in people, and not in brands.
For decades, Amazon was the North Star for every ambitious founder and every investor betting on the future. Its flywheel strategy, its obsession with customer experience, and its relentless pursuit of scale were studied, copied, and idolized. But in the aftermath of its antitrust reckoning, a more sobering perspective emerged. What if Amazon's greatest strengths were also its greatest liabilities? The first and most obvious lesson was this: scale is not immunity. For years, tech leaders believed that growth would protect them. More users, more revenue, more market share. Amazon proved otherwise. With every new seller onboarded, with every algorithm refined, the company amassed more responsibility. And in the eyes of regulators, more responsibility meant more scrutiny. Startups once told to move fast and break things now heard a different mantra: move smart and document everything. Compliance, once a formality, became a core business function. Founders started hiring legal advisors not just to manage risk, but to preempt systemic design flaws. The age of "we'll fix it later" had ended. In the wake of Amazon, later could mean litigation. The second lesson was about architecture. Amazon didn't just compete, it controlled the marketplace where competition occurred. This dual role, referee and player, was central to the antitrust arguments against it. Entrepreneurs and platform builders watching the fallout began asking harder questions. Should we sell products on our own platform? Should we touch user data from third parties? Where is the line between optimization and exploitation? The case reframed how the tech world understood conflict of interest. It wasn't about bad actors, it was about bad incentives baked into systems. Amazon didn't need to be malicious to be dominant. It just needed to be efficient and unregulated and alone in its lane for too long. Third, the Amazon saga became a lesson in narrative fragility. For 2 decades, the company had built an image of trust: smiling boxes, one-click delivery, a helpful Alexa waiting to serve. But when internal documents, whistleblowers, and leaked emails contradicted that narrative, trust shattered quickly. Not just because of what was done, but because of what was denied. Reputation, it turns out, is not a moat, it's a mirror. And when the public sees through it, the damage is permanent. For investors, the story was just as instructive. Amazon had once been the ultimate long-term bet, but by 2022, funds began to calculate regulatory exposure as a core factor in valuation. ESG analysts included algorithm transparency in their assessments, and shareholder proposals demanding ethical use of seller data and algorithmic neutrality began appearing at annual meetings, not as activist stunts, but as prudent governance. Perhaps the most enduring lesson, though, was philosophical. Amazon showed the world that it is possible to build a machine so powerful that no one, not even its creators, fully controls its consequences. Marketplace dynamics, search rankings, private label incentives, seller dependencies, all of it became part of a system that rewarded dominance, often at the cost of fairness. And so the question for the next generation of tech builders was no longer just, how do we grow? It was, what do we grow into? And what will we leave behind when we get there? Because scale is no longer just a metric, it's a responsibility. And every founder now builds in the shadow of the empire that forgot that too late.
The courtroom lights dim, the headlines fade. Settlements are signed, executives reshuffled, policies updated. But when the dust settles, something else remains, something quieter, heavier, more enduring than any fine or footnote, a precedent. Amazon's antitrust saga will not be remembered as a singular event. It will be remembered as the opening chapter in a new era of digital accountability, one in which size is not the final measure of success, and convenience no longer guarantees consent. Already, the tectonic plates beneath the global tech landscape are shifting. In Washington, bipartisan lawmakers continue pushing forward legislation that would once have been unthinkable. Bills like the Ending Platform Monopolies Act and the Open App Markets Act seek to decouple platforms from the services that depend on them. They carry echoes of Standard Oil and AT&T, but with a modern twist. The goal is not to break companies apart, but to unbundle the power embedded in code. In Europe, regulators are going further. The Digital Markets Act, passed in 2022, now mandates that gatekeepers, a term that could have been coined for Amazon, offer interoperability, transparency, and neutrality by default. In India, Brazil, and Australia, copycat frameworks are emerging. Amazon isn't just being watched, it's being reverse-engineered into new legal doctrines. But beyond law, something more subtle is happening. A new generation of founders, raised not on dreams of domination, but on the ethics of design, is reimagining what platforms can be. They speak not of flywheels, but of friction, transparency, and trust. They build cooperatives, federated platforms, open protocols. They don't just ask how to scale, they ask why. At the same time, consumers, once passive beneficiaries of platform wars, are waking up. Browser extensions track algorithmic bias. Online forums dissect ranking systems. Grassroots campaigns call for ethical shopping direct from brand purchases and the right to opt out of surveillance-driven convenience. And Amazon, it continues to grow. It experiments with drone delivery, cashierless stores, and AI-enhanced customer service. It remains a colossus, but not the kind that walks freely anymore. Every decision is now shadowed by the question, will this trigger another case, another leak, another reckoning? Jeff Bezos once said that Amazon was built to be Earth's most customer-centric company. But in the coming decades, customer centricity may no longer be enough. Stakeholder centricity, sellers, regulators, developers, society, may be the new standard. Because if platforms are the infrastructure of modern life, then their responsibility must be infrastructural too. So, where does this story end? Perhaps it doesn't. Perhaps Amazon was never the final villain, nor the final innovator, but merely the first company to face the consequences of building faster than the world could govern. Because empires do not fall in a day. They fragment, they transform, and sometimes they evolve into something else entirely. Less absolute, more accountable. As for the next antitrust story, it may already be unfolding. In a startup no one's watching. In an algorithm no one understands. In a marketplace that promises freedom but hides its rules. Because monopolies don't disappear. They adapt. And in the platform age, the file is closed. For now.